So I'm going to move this over here. I like to move around. I got a lot of energy, I guess, as people say. And so I'm going to talk to you in a nonlinear form. And but I will give you some structure. But I wanted to kind of give you the title and what we're going to be kind of talking about and how I got to be involved in this. So my name is Anthony Nocella, professor at Hamline University. And recently this book came out. And I'm really excited about it, Earth, Animal, and Disability Liberation, the rise of the eco-ability movement. So if I can like see hands or wiggles or whatever from people that understand or know or heard of the term called ecofeminism. Okay, cool. So in that same breath, we're kind of trying to do the same thing in making an radical intersectional connection between disability liberation and animal liberation and earth liberation, right? And there's already people in this room that are like doing these kind of things, and there's a journal issue that's coming out that's going to be speaking about these things too. And then, so we critique the environmental movement on how it's ableist, but we also critique the animal rights movement on how it's ableist. So we've, heard from, my dear friend Breeze on how the movement is racist, right? And this is kind of the work that we do too, and I really wanted to kind of speak to that at the very end, which kind of falls into the realm of prison abolition. And I think maybe you have to wiggle this every so often. You have to sit here and just wiggle it. Okay. So, before we go to my, do you want to go to my computer? No, okay. You're like, no. Okay. So, yeah.
Never.
There we go. I'd say like 30 minutes. So I'll just keep on going. So we can start critiquing it just like Bree started critiquing the animal rights and environmental movement. Well, not the environmental movement. A number of other people have done that, like the rise of the environmental justice movement started critiquing the racist politics, like Sierra Club not allowing people of color and women to the late 1950s, right? Saying, you have the great Edward Abbey, the father of Earth First, saying that, people that were black had smaller brains, right? And believing in eugenics and they were closer to apes, right? And so we have to see how even the revolutionary environmental groups and the lobbyist groups have perpetuated in some way a racist framework, right, through the environmental movement. So I'm going to kind of talk about ableism and how it's being done, and how we, even today in this room, are perpetuating it, right? And oh, we got to slide it up. Okay. So, a little cartoon, because I like cartoons. If being normal is natural, why is it such a strain? And normal isn't natural, right? And that's kind of the foundation of the eco-ability concept, is that normal is a social construction perpetuated by white supremacy, patriarchy, heteronormative agendas, and Christian values, European education, et cetera, right? All these very oppressive institutions and industries and systems of domination, as bell hooks would say, right? So I'm going to talk a little bit about critical animal studies, my story, my activism coming from like a feminist analysis. I think I should start with myself and then kind of go and talk about, and then I'll talk to you a little bit about why I've got this little book up here, which I have a chapter in, that's why, so to keep you not. I just saw this getting dark, so. My story, first, critical animal studies, it started in 2007, 2006, and the whole idea, really short, is that it's not just about non-human animals, right? Anybody that does critical animal studies makes an intersection with all oppression, and really genuine, not like going to the critical resistance prison abolition conference and handing out why vegans to try to make black liberationists vegan, right? No, to try to make you, a less of an anti-racist, or going to a queer rally and truly being there for queer liberation rather than passing out literature on veganism. Does that make sense? So really, truly, genuinely being in other struggles and having somebody say to you 1 minute, are you vegan? And having that question you because you do so much activism in another movement, right? And so critical animal studies or critical animal theory demands you to be in other movements. You can't do one issue. And like, as we are today in activism and theory, with the breakdown of classic disciplines, the breakdown of single issue movements, we have to be interested in other things, right? Like, women and gender is not enough. Like, we have to focus on women, gender, transnational feminism, and anarchism. And that's what dissertations, masters, and then that's what, progressive papers are looking at, and scholars are doing. They're trying to make these connections. And where they're not where they're not connected, you try to make them. And I even gone to the farthest extent and was not accepted to a feminist conference, which I won't say which feminist conference, but I made the connection between critical animal studies and critical alien studies. And they're like, what? And I won't talk about that. But try to make the connection that, like, we have to decenter ourselves. And yeah, I do believe in aliens. I'm not so, self-centered to not, right? We did believe in the world was flat at one time and people were killed to think otherwise. So my activism really is entrenched in my disabilities. At a very young age, I was diagnosed having severe disabilities, put into special ed, 1st to 4th grade. They didn't have Ritalin back then. I only was introduced to Ritalin when I was a senior, which destroyed my kidney, and I got off of it like in a month. And but special ed was a very abusive place. It was the last form, and still is the last form of segregation education, right? We all say that we're against segregation, right? But we still have it fostering and promoted in this like, if you think differently, we'll stick you in special ed, right? And so there I am, and strapped down to, I see friends, myself, strapped down to chairs, strapped down to walls, held down, because we had a lot of energy, right? And then where we go is to the whole idea of going into special private segregated schools, right? The first one was called a laboratory, and after two years, and I found a fond love towards the Animal Liberation Front, and because they couldn't speak and they don't have a voice, they just liberate non-human animals from abuse. And I started understanding why the Animal Liberation Front, and other oppressed groups did what they did in such an extreme way, because they didn't have a voice, or if they did have a voice, it was through their actions, right? And so Temple University Laboratory, where I was for a few years, was closed down because of property destruction. Half the building was burned down because there was this outrage and anger with the students not being appreciated and respected. Does that make sense? And so later, the walls and the doors of Temple University were literally, laboratory, were literally turned into prison doors, right? So that was my first experience of like, okay, there's something going on here. Then I went to Houston, Texas. My family moved from Philly to Houston, Texas. And then in Houston, Texas, I was in another segregated school, very expensive segregated school. Then I started understanding what it means to be white and what it means to be wealthy. And then where did all my friends go that were in special ed that were public, right? All my kids, friends of color were in special ed public schools, right? Being warehoused while I was in this private rich school, right? And only, small schools, segregated, 13 kids graduating, medication, counseling for every kid, etc., right? Still didn't know how to learn, read and write. Was running up and down the halls. Couldn't sit still. Every time I got frustrated, I broke something. I broke so many things in my house that my parents kept me out of the house from 9 to 5, right? Until I got home, right? We have to. So this is where I'm coming from. This really frustrating perspective, and so. In 11th grade, I got into animal rights, right? And then I started learning how to read, the, is, dog, all these things. And, but I was like, when I started learning all these things, I'm like, PETA? No, I'm not gonna hug no bunny. I'm not going to hug any dog. I'm not going to do anything cute. It's like, this is not me. I want to cause damage. And that's how I express myself. And so because I expressed myself this way, I, was a really angry kid. And so it made real common sense for me to support, these extremist, radical underground groups, identified as, terrorist groups, right? And even though they never harmed any living creature, since 1976, the founding of it. And so this is where I started doing writing and talking about love. And at that same time period, in my middle school, I also was a Quaker, right? Who knows what a Quaker is? And I'm not talking about opium. Quakers are people that had a real strong value of prison abolition. The first support group, oddly enough, of the ALF in England, where Ronnie Lee was in prison still, and people were supporting Ronnie Lee, the founder of the ALF, was in a Quaker meeting or a Quaker institution, right? And they started writing letters, right, to Ronnie Lee. And I felt this resonance, like, wow, here I am. I'm a person with true pacifist values, non-violent, like, had love in my heart, and I just didn't know how to express myself, right? And so it really made sense how I got into, the environmentalism, radical, politics. So that's my activism. So it was really clear, my activism went from anti-war demonstrations to radical environmental movements to disability to queer, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it was just natural for me to make these interconnections while other people just kind of focused on one thing at a time. Does that make sense? So my scholarship, I've done a number of books now. In 11th grade, I learned how to read The Is Dog from a prison educator, oddly enough. And this prison educator, at that same year, committed suicide. And so, people thought I was going to commit suicide, and I said, no, I'm not going to give up on my life. I see these judgments, I see, I'm not saying I haven't thought about it, but I think, the world is faced with struggles. And I found out really quickly that disability studies, eco-ability, and the whole concept is all about interdependency and working together, and it's about being interwoven with each other. No one is an individual. So DIY, does anybody know what DIY is? Raise your hand if you know what DIY is. Do it yourself. So in this article, Queer Cripping Anarchism is our chapter title. It's the first one that kind of connects the three, is we're against DIY. We're for DIT. And DIT is do it together. Everything you can do it together. And so that's kind of our philosophy. And so for you normal people out there, no, there's nobody normal. But I wanted to put some order and structure to here. So kind of talk to you about what disability and normalcy is, what eco-ability is, what eco-ability challenge in the criminal justice system is, prison abolition and transformative justice. Sound good? Kind of give you an outline. People always kind of get confused where I am. So equal, social construction. I've done a lot of volunteering, started a lot of GED programs in New York. I forget I'm in New York now, because I teach in the Twin Cities, so it's really good to be back here. And so equal is a social construction. So I was in a detention center. I worked in every single detention center, volunteered in every single detention center in New York. Aided in closing down one too, which is really exciting. And I gave everybody a ruler. And it was a 6-inch rule because they can't have a 12-inch rule because they're going to kill somebody with a 12-inch ruler. But not a 6-inch ruler. Okay, gotcha. So I gave them all a 6-inch ruler when they had only a 2-inch piece, like a pencil. And so I said, where's equal in this measurement? And I said, what do you mean? I was like, where's equal? It's a measurement. It's a methodology. Where is it? And he said, I don't know. And exactly. It's socially constructed. It doesn't exist. No one's equal. And they're like, no one's equal, then what are we fighting for, right? And I said, what you're fighting for is justice and equity, right? Not equality. And there's a major difference between equity and equality. And so, and I don't want to have sameness. No one here is the same, right? Disability is a social construction that is put onto everybody here. If your hands are too big for a pencil, you have a disability. If Shaquille O'Neal came into this door, he would hit his head. He has a disability. If somebody's too tall and they sat in this chair, they would have a disability. It's the systems and the structures around us that make us have disabilities. It's not, nothing's wrong with you all, right? Everybody has differences, but it's the systems around that you create disabilities. I did a lecture in Columbia College recently in Chicago, and somebody was in braces, right? And he was maybe 18 years old, and he said, I have disabilities. Like, see these? And he like waved them up in the air, and I really felt a passion towards him. And he says, I can't take this anymore. I have a disability, and I'm out of this room, right? But there was nothing wrong with him. And so, like other oppressed, marginalized groups, there's self-hate, self-marginalizing, and not understanding that there's nothing wrong with it. And I had that too, you know, and a lot of people in this room have had that with their own identities, right? And so it's really hard to figure out that maybe if we had a world that had sidewalks that moved, like airport sidewalks inside, then the world would, you know, would make that individual have less disabilities, right? And if there was no steps in a university, but only ramps, guess what? The people in wheelchairs would not have disabilities, right? So it's the structures that we create. And some universities, I'm sure, you know, possibly Vassar, but, you know, Vassar is pretty darn progressive. So I don't know if you all have it, but you know the old chairs, it's like the chair and the desk in one, and then you pivot up, right? It creates a disability of those individuals that are left-handed or pregnant or just bigger than 5'7" and 135 pounds. Does that make sense? So it's the structures around us that create us have disabilities. So, you know, normalcy and normal are different. Normal is the state, right? Normalcy is the philosophy behind the perpetuation of normal, right? And if people know, the first people in the Holocaust were tested on and killed to perpetuate this normalcy, right? And so we can see this normalcy that's being played out in our schools, K to 12, through rubrics. Has anybody ever heard of a rubric? Raise your hand. Okay. Grades, right? Standards tests, quizzes, reading values. Have to do 2 to 3 pages a week, 100 pages a week to read. These are constructed standards or standardization that's perpetuating normalcy, right? But education in higher education is now funded by corporate, you know, entities and the academic industrial complex. So again, if we can get away from that, you know, and there's some progressive schools like here that you can create your own, you know, degree and things of that sort, then we're trying to challenge it, but we're still caught up in this capitalist corporate, you know, framework that we're perpetuating normalcy and the individualism. So I wanted to kind of talk about that. Here's this, talking about a little bit about capitalism and disability. It promotes competitiveness rather than collaboration. John Dewey talked about collaboration, that no individual, no child should read a book by themselves. What a great concept, right? Consumerism, making a product that this book is perfect for certain people's eyes, but not certain other people's eyes. And if you have hands, right? And if you're able-bodied and able to flip this, right? So this book is only good for certain people. And that's what we have to understand, that there is these systems that perpetuate and that we have to challenge and dismantle. So here's eco-ability, really quick, and what it values, right? So it's like this new concept. What does it value? It values difference, which I was talking about, holistic transformation. Not oppressing one person because you did something wrong and kicking you out of the movement, but transforming and healing from it, right? And working towards that. And understanding that people have differences, right? Engaging in critical and practical, understanding, and I'll talk a little bit about techno-digital justice, right? Which green anarchists, raise your hand if you know what green anarchism is, some people. Okay, John Zerzan and others really challenge the value of any technology whatsoever, which like this room would not exist, right? But we understand the value of glasses. We understand the value of, you know, body modifications for trans individuals. That still to this day, if you want to modify your body, right, you have to say that you have a gender disorder. Does anybody know that? Right? So if you still have, so we're talking about, you know, an individual which he spoke about and then was challenged by the radical trans community in Toronto. And so none of this technology would exist, right? And a lot of us would not be able to be where we are today, right? And our family, our grandparents, we would just assume that they just die off, right? And we can't have caskets for them, so we'll just like dig a hole for them and let them go. And I think that we have to complicate these things, right? Yeah, there is problems with technology, and there is problems with mining. There is problems with clear-cutting massive forests for technology. And that's why I say there's a difference between techno-digital justice and digital equity. Digital equity is making sure that everyone has a laptop. While 4 of you over there are playing games, and these people are trying to eliminate the enslavement of people in prisons in the US, right? And through a person with political values, I say that they should have computers and you all playing on games should not. And some people will challenge that notion. But if we're going to use this, we have to try to eliminate the amount of oppression that is going on. So, eco-liberation, I already kind of spoke about it. It comes from like an animal liberation, disability liberation, and earth liberation movement. And it's played out through practice and theory. And of course, we know these binaries that exist through eco-ability resistance, animal liberation versus speciesism, disability liberation versus ableism. Ableism is the perpetuation of normalcy and the language that we use. So, and I'll get into language like insane and crazy and moron and boring. And we'll talk about that and how we in the movement use these. And in school and in higher education, use this language, right? We want to cripple capitalism, right? And earth liberation, challenging civilization, right? And what does civilization really mean? It's not just a bunch of houses, but it's a philosophy too. And this philosophy is against savageness, right? Against wild. It's for domestication. It's for property, right? So, maybe if I click again. Oh, it didn't come up. Okay. So, so there's a picture here and a picture there, and this picture over here is, if you can like imagine, okay. So I'm not going to say like pretend you're blind because people that are blind can still see. So on the left, right over here, is Peter Singer getting protested. Peter Singer is the founder of the Animal Liberation Movement, 1975. His book came out, and then above here is like 4 beautiful laboratory dogs or lab dogs, black and gold, or what is it, blonde or gold labs that are service dogs. Okay, and so I'm just going to do it clockwise. First of lab dogs and why that service animals, horses, dogs, monkeys, etc., bunnies even, are not, they're enslaved, right? They are oppressed, marginalized individuals that are in a relationship that is very oppressive. But they work 24/7, right? And so what we need to do is challenge the service relationship between the owner, which they are an owner of this property. Does that make sense? And it's really difficult because, being diagnosed, a variety of things at a very young age, and then, being involved in the autistic community, and there's people probably here that are involved in the autistic community, and, they say, oh, what we need to do is get autistic kids on top of horses, and they're going to have a great enjoyment. But did you know that autism is a spectrum? And in the last 10 years, the rise of the spectrum is perpetuated and supported by pharmaceutical industries, right? So, hey, does anybody like being in a room that they don't know anybody? You might have autism. Don't like wearing tight clothes? You might have autism, right? Like, okay, don't like to be brushed up in a club by people that you don't know? Well, you might have autism. And it's a spectrum to put other people in these labels. It doesn't mean that these people that have autism don't have differences and have challenges in society. They do, right? But it's a way that the industries perpetuate the oppression and the marginalization of anything and anybody that is different, right? I'm surprised that there's not autistic cats and dogs and trees yet. Because people are really on the bandwagon of anything that is autistic. Of course, like you know, right before autism, there was ADHD, and everybody had ADHD. Anybody, you know, wanting to walk around and not sit still for 2 hours has ADHD, or attention deficit disorder, or is hyperactive, right? And I think we're changing as a society and youth and young people, that we're interested in being on 2 computers and a phone at the same time, and we can't pay attention to a teacher that's writing on a chalkboard. Does that make sense? So it's nothing that's wrong with us. We're just adapting and changing to our climate, right? So, and then of course, I talked to you a little bit about green anarchism, and that, you know, shock therapy, and a lot of the animal testing that has occurred has also occurred to people with disabilities in institutions. For example, lobotomy would be a perfect example. If you know what a lobotomy is, the lobotomy, I don't know, these people had like PhDs and like from MIT. I mean, these were brilliant people. But for some reason, until the late 1950s, they thought putting an ice pick in somebody's eye and whipping it around would allow them to believe that they wouldn't have a disability, a mental disability anymore, right? I think any 5th grader would tell this individual that this would not work. And guess what? It didn't work. It never worked, right? It actually killed a few people, right? And you can Google it, YouTube, like the practice. It's pretty horrifying. Sometimes they didn't go through the eye. They sometimes went through the temple. They chiseled. And there's a great movie about this, critiquing this, that Jack Nicholson did. It's called One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And a book's out, really speaking to this problem. And so we can kind of now slide in to, now this is like my non-linear thinking, okay? So like, bear with me. People with disabilities, the whole concept of disability, the philosophy of disability is all based on stigma, right? You can be black, white, Puerto Rican, a 10-year-old female, an insider in a prison, or a person in Africa. You can be anywhere and still be labeled as a person with disabilities, right? It's this like moving invisible hand, right? And so right after 2001, there was this little cartoon that popped up. And I'll just read it really quick. American flag, $23. Gasoline, $2. Cigarette lighter, $1.50. Catch yourself on fire because you're a retard? Terrorist, priceless, right? And now we're getting to see the intersections of disability and terrorism, okay? Like what I was talking about before, the first groups I was interested in, and now what I'm talking about in my dissertation was on, is the title was the Disability Perspective on the Terrorization of Dissent, right? And today we could see the Connecticut shooting of those 20 kids that were majority white, I believe, and how this kid that went in there had a disability, right? Virginia Tech, mentally insane. The media said it, bam. What happened in Arizona? The shooting of the state representative and the senator and the judge, another person with mental disabilities, right? Even though certain individuals went there for political or social reasons, right? I'm not saying I agree with them, I don't, right? But we can't just label somebody and say the NRA, and then now the federal government is saying anybody that has a disability, we've got to put them on a watch list, right? That's what they're saying. And what we need to do is not allow these people with disabilities to have guns, right? Because they're more of a threat. But we know that people with disabilities also are some beautiful, kind people. Some of them that wrote books, 6 books, and created the ACLU, which I'm talking about Helen Keller, right? And so it's not the individual that has a disability that makes you violent. It's possibly, you know, something else that's going on that makes you violent. Because you're a violent individual. Or you have political, you know, an agenda, and then you believe, because you have this political agenda, right, there's a 24-hour long or so plus manifesto of the individual that shot everybody in Virginia Tech. Does everyone know that? Like, there was a big manifesto. He took a lot of time, right? He was critiquing consumerism, why he couldn't get a girlfriend, why his girlfriend left him. He was talking about why his home was small, that people made fun of him that you know, he couldn't speak proper English. These are like also known as, you know, he was challenging this notion of bullying, getting bullied, right? I mean, but the problem is, like, if you're getting bullied, sometimes the right answer is not violence, but talking to people and counseling, but he didn't have anybody to talk to, right? I do a lot of workshops around the country for K-12. Best way of eliminating bullying, which is just like a catchphrase, is talking and respecting people's differences. What a concept, right? So here we are with another image, right? Right after September 11th, right? The state of this nation: deaf regimes, left, blind terrorists, right, and a mute masses, right? And so here we are. If you want to put somebody down, best way of doing it, use the language of ableism, right? Call them retarded, call them insane. Okay. So now we have a critique of the government and how they use and repress people with disabilities. And now I'm going into specifically the criminal justice system. And then I'm going to wrap up and then we'll take some quick questions. So animal rights supports racism. Okay, and this was really like organized, but I think it makes it a little bit funny. So Mike Vick for the animal rights movement supports Mike Vick because because the animal rights movement profiles and criminalizes people of color, right? There's tons, and I won't go down the specific names and lines, but there's leading individuals in the environmental movement, and more so in the animal rights movement, that have caused destruction to the ecology and complete murder and torture to non-human animals. And they're all white, males, heterosexual, able-bodied, right? I could think of 5 right off the bat, right? And they're significant, right? We allow them in our movement, right? Which I think we should, right? People transform. But when Mike Vick, and there's a critique of Mike Vick, and I have a critique back onto those individuals. Mike Vick didn't do it voluntarily. He had to get arrested, right? And incarcerated. So he didn't. All these other individuals did it voluntarily and were incarcerated, weren't incarcerated, right? So there's the difference, right? And Mike Vick really never said sorry, right? So we should focus on Mike Vick. And I go into any class right now and I say Mike Vick, and the first thing that anybody comes to mind is dogfighter, right? Nothing good, nothing positive, right? And I think we need to and we can talk about this in the Q&A and all these things, is how do we problematize this? How do we problematize the criminalization of individuals, specifically that do fighting? So if we take it from a micro to macro and look at cultural imperialism, like bull riding is okay and legal. The largest bull riding and the rodeo is in Houston, Texas, right? But we, in the white America and white European cultural imperialism, perpetuating it, is against bullfighting and cockfighting, right? Which are not dominated through a white lens, right? And not practiced by the white culture. Does that make sense? So we have to really challenge these notions of why are we going to other countries like Japan and telling them what to do, or going to native communities while we have a slaughterhouse in the back of our neighborhood, right? And the reason a lot of the times is it's easier, right? It's easier to target other oppressed groups, right? And we have to really challenge and problematize these things. So jailing abusers, right? This is the classic. HSUS, so many local grassroots animal rights movement and Facebook all the time. Dog abuse, some 13-year-old microwaves a cat. It's horrible. I've seen it. I know kids that have done it, right? What do? We use the punitive justice system and tell them to lock them up, right? And guess what? They become really bitter and they probably do it again, or a lot of the kids become more violent after they leave a juvenile detention center, a prison, or a jail. And it's not transformative or healing whatsoever. Again, oppose the AETA oppression, but note when we're against the AETA, the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, which says that the animal activists and environmental activists are terrorists, that was signed into bill in 2006. So we're against that, and we believe that we're the complete most repressed movement in the country, while not addressing that there are still, after 40 years, black liberationists in prison in the U.S., right? And Puerto Ricans that were still, organizing in the 1970s that are still arrested. Native Americans that are still arrested, right? And we don't address these or try to build solidarity in the large gaps. But we talk about our oppression and our repression. And finally, how organizations and individuals demonize a nonviolent group that does do criminal acts. I'm not going, I teach criminology 101 and juvenile justice, etc. for like the last 5 years. I'm not saying the ALF, under a legal framework, is doing anything legal. They are. But to demonize them as violent and terrorist really minimizes the power of that word, right? But what are they terrorists of? They're terrorists of property, they're terrorists of consumption, corporations consuming and making profits of non-human animals in the environment. So it's 7:58, and I've got one more slide, or two more slides, like really one more. So making social justice inclusive, right? And I want to like leave you with this, is don't say equal, say different. Don't say voiceless, say allies. Don't say march, we're going to march to something. Say it's a rally or a protest, because not everybody marches. Sometimes some people roll. Don't say stand up, say fight back. Don't say that the individual's an idiot. Say he's dangerous, or she's dangerous, or they're dangerous. Don't say you're blind to racism. Say you're ignorant to racism, or you're not informed about racism, right? Don't say you're deaf. Say that you're avoiding. And there's so many others, right? There's other words that, are ableist. There's an organization that I work with, Transformative Justice, and unlike restorative justice, Transformative Justice talks about oppression, really supported by the trans queer community, and talks about that we should be prison abolitionists, but we should also look at identity politics, class, race, gender, and homophobia when we're talking about victimization and who separating and taking apart that whole concept of victim over here and offender over here, because a lot of times the offender is also a victim and the victim sometimes is an offender, and complicating that. So I think that's the last slide. So break the chains of normalcy and punishment. So thank you so much, and we'll take questions.
Can you talk more about the techno-digital justice thing, like especially in terms of what Riz was saying about how our consumer choices are inherently part of an exploitative system. So like we have these things and someone else kind of exploited or deprived of something for them. So can you talk more about how to achieve techno-digital justice without like you said, strip mining, clear cutting, oppressing workers who make the technology?
I mean, every single cell phone has a particular metal in it. It comes from South America or Africa, right? And in Africa, it's you have to strip mine. So there's like this intersection. You have to strip mine it, so you have to destroy the environment, the ecological environment. Then you have to destroy the gorilla habitat, and you have to kill gorillas. And then what they do is the miners are youth, right? Youth of color that do the mining. And so we have to be conscious of what we're getting ourselves into. Like a diamond. People say there's fair trade diamonds. There's no such thing as a fair trade diamond. Because if you value this item, right, even if it's a fake item, you're still valuing the look of it. And that's what we have to try to get away from, is the look and the concept that's behind this. So it's not about just having fair trade coffee, because you're still putting a value to coffee and keeping that value globally high. If you look at global economics, and there's a lot of other products like that too, like bananas in South and Central America. So being conscious of all the things, and then minimizing the amount of technology that we use, right? And informing as many people as possible of the technology if it was exploited. So like Apple, right? We heard about this about 8 months ago, how the Apple sweatshops, people are like supposedly jumping out windows, but there is like people are not treated, fairly, and of course there's no unions there. So telling each other about these issues, I think that would be like the most important thing. And sharing what an anarchist concept. Instead of having like 5 laptops in one room, maybe sharing a laptop instead of buying one, or having 20 computers or 20 TVs, sharing resources, mutual aid. Yes?
So you bring a lot of contradictions between the disability movement and the eco movement. How do you resolve those contradictions? How do we deal with people like Peter Singer and not have a lot of questions being raised to deal with for them? How do we deal with those who want to take apart civilization, but also threaten the access of many of those who need the access granted by civilization? A lot of my disability friends are against anarchists, because anarchists want to get rid of their means of access, and that's offensive to them. And so I just don't know how you would resolve these conversations. I would love to hear.
I think dialogue, education, and a respectful calling out, but not calling out where people have to like get kicked out of conferences or get kicked out of movements, or not get invited. I think the really difficult is when you bring these people together and have these heart-to-heart. That's what academia is about: is bringing people together, because I might not agree with everything in a green anarchist anti-civilization framework, but they had so much to offer the larger environmental justice, the larger environmental movement, that critique of technology that nobody else did. But that's why eco-ability has to come right back and say, wait a second, right? It's not that we take, it all or nothing. I think we have to take a little bit of everything, right? Like there's critiques of, there's a lot of critiques in like Peter Singer, but there's a lot of things I value as well. But I also think that it's great that ADAPT and other radical disability organizations have protested and wanted him banned from Princeton University for his advocacy of wanting to, test on youth and babies for the larger, good of society because of his principles, utilitarianism. If that, you might not agree, but that would be my thought, is just like listening and learning from each other. But at the same time challenging and making people feel a little uncomfortable. I've been called on a lot of my stuff, and I've been challenged a lot, and I feel fine with that because it makes me more humble as a person.
I have a question about your experience where you were giving a presentation and you mentioned there was a gentleman in the room who disagreed with your claim that he wasn't disabled when he felt that he was. So, and you said he walked out of the room? I'm curious to hear about that, just because how do you create like safe spaces and how do you address that, like when people don't feel comfortable in dialogue? So, yeah, was there anything you did to follow up with that or talk about that in the room?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, I don't want to put him on, but we talked about it, and was a student of a faculty member I knew, and so it was going, but it's really hard. Disability is the only identity at every school and university that you are not allowed to find out who has a disability. If you go to a multicultural center, you can say, oh, here's a multicultural center, and there's the African American wing over here, and there's the Somali wing over here, and Peter is from Zimbabwe, so here's his email. And I've seen this, I've witnessed it, I've even participated in it, but when I say, hey, do you know any kids with like disabilities, or any faculty or staff with disabilities, I can't give that information out. So there's this massive stigma on people with disabilities that needs to be challenged first. And I do think he has disabilities, but it's society that has made him have disabilities, and that was like the real hard thing. That and the conversation of disabilities and social justice is still pretty new. It's very new in the animal rights environmental movement.
This is about what you said about, like, the example you gave with Michael Vick. Do you think that he shouldn't have been criminalized at all? What exactly do you think should have been done about a situation like Michael Vick?
I don't believe in the prison system. I mean, I believe in it. I know it exists. It doesn't benefit anybody. So I would not criminalize him. He's already criminalized in society in, like, you know, theoretical way, labeled, destigmatized. But I think what we could do is, like most people, right? Which I talk to, you know, kids in the hip hop community because I'm really involved in the hip hop community, and I talk to them about bullfighting, and like, I never thought about that. It's just like part of our culture, right? Like, not like we weren't born vegans. We weren't like we were also born pretty horrible, torturing non-human animals in our indirect way too. We were eating animals, a lot of us in this room, and still are, and that's fine. Like, I understand we are learning and adapting, and then we go to college to learn more about feminism and trans, gender issues and disability. And so, Syracuse University, where I got my PhD, they kicked 2 kids off for doing racist, things, right? It's a very punitive system. We have one of the best African American studies programs in the country, where Angela Davis was visiting for like 3 or 4 years, right? And so I was saying, like, why wouldn't this, like, these students take classes from, some of these brilliant individuals, right? And some of these faculty and students also agreed with that, right? Like, when I was in 12th grade, I never knew what, like, queer issues were. I was queer, but I didn't know what it was. And, like, somebody talked to me about queer trans issues. I didn't know, like, the difference between a transgender and transsexual, right? So I think that's what I would advocate for, is like education and not rehabilitation. That is to say that there's something wrong with him, right? Mentally or physically or cognitively, right? When poor people steal, right? Like TVs and things, there's nothing to be rehabilitated. They're brilliant. They're stealing to make money, and they're getting food and rent to pay for food and shelter. That's logical, right? They don't need to be rehabilitated, right? To not do that, it needs rehabilitation. Does that make?
Well, Michael Vick didn't kill dogs out of necessity. So I think there's a huge disconnect between someone stealing for need and someone fighting dogs out of whatever he got out of it. So I think that there is something inherently wrong with what he did, and that should somehow be addressed in some manner, if not prison. And I guess I'm just asking how would you address something like that?
Malcolm X once said, and it's a great quote, "Education is the passport to the future, for tomorrow belongs to those who prepare for it today," right? And I think education, like this, have Mike Vick, take seminars in animal advocacy, and get involved in animal, rights groups, have them read some books, have them, talk to some people, right? These conversations are privileged conversations, and we're here privileged to have these conversations. And so, and I think, locking somebody up because they did something wrong, because it's very dominant cultural, dogfighting is a cultural entertainment practice, just like bullfighting. But that bullfighting is legal in certain countries, and so is bull riding. And I don't see any difference between bull riding and dogfighting. But one's legal and one's not legal. And we have to understand why is one not legal and one legal. It's really interesting because if we made a binary of the structure, all of the illegal cultural entertainment used by non-human animals would be, communities and cultures that are represented by people of color, while the legal, animal abuse by non-human animals are those by the white community, And we go to Japan with the dolphins, and problematizing it and complicating it. So my point would be get Mike Vick to go to Vassar.
Just to add to that, there are organizations that are doing this. Bard, from where we hail, has a Bard Prison Initiative, which is teaching in New York maximum security prisons. But it's like a super exclusive program because of resources and such. So it would be cool if this was happening more.